tunics. I cannot overemphasize the importance of a tunic in ancient Rome, and this would prevail throughout the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, etc., etc. Hey, we saw the tunic really growing in popularity and coming up there in the Mycenaean culture, didn't we? But it was the Romans who grabbed onto it and ran with it. Both men and women in ancient Rome wore tunics beneath either their togas, men, or their stolas, women. We'll look at stolas in a second. Do not confuse the Roman look with that of ancient Greece, where men would wear the hymation as an aschiton or akiton with nothing underneath, right? You know, sort of wrapped around like at a toga party. No, that is not what the Romans did. The Romans wore togas, which were structured differently, and they wore a tunic underneath it. But of course, when we think of Roman fashion, we think of togas. Togas were worn by men. And they were not just a rectangular piece of fabric like the hymation. They were structured. The Republican toga, which is what the patricians would wear, would be between 12 and 15 feet long and 6 feet wide. However, Caesar, the emperor, and his family, the male members of his family, would wear a toga that was longer, wider, had more fabric, and was just more spectacular. And this is how you put a toga on. You can see the guy is wearing a tunic. It always started with a tunic, and then you usually needed a slave to help you get into one, to wrap it around. And you can see what's happening here in these depictions. It goes over one shoulder, then it is wrapped around and pulled around the waist, and then the flap that you're working with folds over your arm. That is how a toga works. First of all, you had to be a Roman to wear a toga. Nobody else was allowed to wear a toga. A freeman was not allowed to wear a toga, for example. Why? Because he was a former slave, right, who had earned his freedom. So he wasn't a Roman. So he was not allowed to wear a toga. You had to be of Roman descent to be allowed to wear a toga, and you had. But there were so many varieties of toga and meanings behind them. This was really using fashion as such a significant article to show who you were, when you were living, and what you belonged to. All right, let's look at the main different kinds of togas. The toga virilis. This was worn only by young men when they first came of age, between 14 and 16, but it was also worn by lower members of the Senate. It was a whitish toga, but it was just the color of natural linen. It was not bleached, a toga virilis. And then this, the toga praetexta. This was worn by boys before they came of age and by slightly higher members of the Senate. This is all confusing, isn't it? And what about this? The toga picta. This was worn by triumphant generals or people who were presiding over gladiatorial games. Sometimes it was embroidered. The toga candida. This was the bleached white tunic that was only worn by higher members of the Senate. The toga pulla. This was a dark-colored toga, and it was worn for mourning or worn at times of imperial crisis. You know, if the city was in trouble, if Rome was in trouble, if there was a new war coming up, if something bad was happening or ominous or worrying, men would pull out their toga pulla. And then, of course, the toga trabea. This was only for the emperor and select members of the royal family because of its color. So you can see here togas were important. And guess what? There's another 12, 15, 20 different kinds of togas for very specific days of honoring a particular god, for example. There were, you know, togas to get married in, etc., etc. But here are the main ones. All right, now I've just said that only the royal family could wear the toga trabea because of its color. And just so you know, from the 2nd century on, it was illegal for Roman women to wear togas, although, weirdly, if you were a prostitute, it was okay. Who knows why? So let's talk about the color purple. Why? Why were only emperors and members of the royal family allowed to wear purple? Because the color was so hard to find and so expensive. You see, before it was synthetically manufactured, purple, which is known as Tyrian purple, was only available from a mucus secretion of the murex sea snail. This made it incredibly valuable and rare. And here is this very sea snail, and in its mucus gland comes the dye that makes Tyrian purple. So as a consequence of its rarity, it was only worn by royalty both in the days of Rome and for centuries beyond. So this reddish-toned purple is also known as imperial purple, royal purple, or Tyrian purple. And it is still the traditional color of royalty. This is Queen Elizabeth II of England at her coronation in the early 1950s, wearing her regal gown of Tyrian purple. All right, let's look at Roman female attire. Here it is. Again, as with the Greeks, it is based on 3 articles of clothing that were worn at the same time. The tunica intima, an intimate tunic. This was long or short-sleeved tunic that was worn beneath your stola. This was a long linen dress, usually with 3/4 length sleeves. There was a lot of pleats in it too, a lot of draping, a stola. So you got up, you put on your tunica intima, and then you put on your stola, and then over your stola went your palla. This was a rectangular mantle or cloak of varying textiles and weight depending on weather and occasion, which you would wrap around your stola, and then you could belt the whole thing. And this is what it looked like in real life. It was usually made of linen, or if you lived in a colder climate, wool. If you were rich, it would be made of silk, acquired along the silk route, and be embroidered and be quite fancy. This is probably a plebeian wearing the palla and stola. The palla and stola was the look. This is all that Roman women wore. And here is how you put on your palla and stola. So you can go back and study that in a bit. You would wear your palla in the same way that a Roman man would wear his toga. Let's look at Roman hair. It was very done up, and depending on what period you're looking at in the Roman Empire, there was always the key hairstyle. Like this, the titulus, which had strands of hair pulled into a top knot at the back. What about this? This is the Severin hairdo. Now we imagine that a lot of this hair was probably made with wigs and hairpieces too. This is probably one of the most unflattering hairdos I could possibly imagine, but it was extremely popular. But this is my favorite. This is the Flavian, and we are pretty sure that that top sort of incredible pile mountain of hair was probably a hairpiece. Hair was extremely important to the ancient Romans, to ancient Roman women. It was the erogenous zone. So hairstyles and fads and hairdos were so important, and the trends in hair changed so frequently that Roman marble busts of women sometimes had removable hair, so that the hairdo could be kept up to date, as it changed so often. How funny is that? But as Seneca said in the 1st century, the writer and philosopher Seneca, we live not according to reason, but according to fashion. And I think when I see women walking up 5th Avenue, going to work wearing 6-8-inch Jimmy Choo heels, not being able to walk, their feet killing them, I think, man, we still live not according to reason, but according to fashion. Headdresses were also very important to ancient Roman women. It was all about the hair, really. Men, however, it wasn't about the hair. Remember, these were serious people. These were military people. And so this was the popular haircut. A short hairdo with bangs sort of brushed forward and cut short, and we still call it the Caesar. Roman footwear. Guess what? Gladiators did not wear gladiator sandals. In fact, the Romans didn't wear sandals very much at all. They wore shoes like this. Here are actual Roman shoes that have survived. These were found in York. Where is York? York is in the north of England. And it was a big Roman settlement, and these part of the Roman Empire, and these shoes have been found. They're really kind of beautiful, aren't they? They're leather, they have soles, and they would be laced to hold them in place. Like this. Again, another genuine pair of Roman shoes, and look at the cleats. Absolutely incredible. Gladiators, however, did not wear gladiator sandals. They wore shoes, and then they had these sort of leg protectors, sort of like a hockey player, tied around their lower legs. Like this, usually made out of leather, sometimes. So, when in Rome, as they say, let's look at the influence of Roman fashion today. Hello, take a look at this. All of these wonderful digitally printed elements from ancient Rome. Roman coins as motifs and details. Roman temples. Absolutely fantastic. And of course, Dolce & Gabbana. Boy, they are fashion history teachers' best friends. Dolce & Gabbana love the past and go back to it constantly. But take a look here. Hello, this is the palla and the stola, but made mini-skirt style. The gladiator sandal, never really worn by gladiators, but still inspired by ancient Rome. And look at these photo shoots, completely inspired by the Roman world of the gladiators. Take a look at that, isn't it fantastic? And that too, centurion chic.